At 1:07 a.m., my son's GPS pinged inside a cemetery. When my headlights hit the fence, I saw him tied up next to two suitcases, and my sister smoking like it was nothing. My name is Alicia, a 32-year-old mother, who made the mistake of thinking I could surprise my family by coming home early. I had boarded a late flight to arrive 2 days ahead of schedule, but the warm reunion I imagined shattered the instant. I opened my son's bedroom door to find a cold and empty bed. I immediately dialed my mother to demand answers about his whereabouts, because he was supposed to be safe in his room. She answered with a terrifying calmness to claim he was sleeping peacefully at my sister's house, for a fun sleepover before their outing tomorrow. Her lie was blatant, because my sister absolutely despised children, and had never once allowed my son to step foot inside her home for any reason. I refused to listen to another word, as I rushed back to my car to drive straight to her place, while checking his location. My heart stopped beating when the GPS locator on his smartwatch loaded to reveal a pulsating blue dot that was nowhere near my sister's house. The screen showed my little boy was sitting alone in the middle of the desolate city cemetery on the far side of town. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal to reach that graveyard at 1 a.m. with pure terror coursing through my veins. The high beams of my headlights cut through the darkness to reveal my terrified son tied to a rusty iron fence next to his packed suitcases. You need to see exactly what happens when a mother goes to war for her child against her own family. Please subscribe to this channel right now to witness how I saved him and made them pay for this unforgivable crime. The gravel crunched loudly under my tires as I slammed the brakes inside the cemetery gates, creating a deafening noise in the silence of the night. I did not even bother to turn off the engine or close the door as I threw myself out of the driver's seat. My legs carried me forward with a speed I did not know I possessed, as I sprinted past rows of weathered tombstones that seemed to watch me in the darkness. The freezing wind whipped against my face to sting my eyes, but I refused to blink for fear of losing sight of the location I had seen on the map. I spotted the silhouette of a vehicle parked near a large oak tree, deep within the grounds. My sister Brenda was sitting casually on the hood of her car with her legs crossed at the ankles. She held a lit cigarette in her hand and watched my frantic approach with a terrifying calmness. The red glow of her cigarette tip was the only source of warmth in this desolate place. Her complete lack of urgency while I was running for my life made my stomach turn with nausea. I finally reached the large tree to witness a sight that nearly brought me to my knees. My son Austin was tethered to the rusted iron fence with thick yellow rope that dug into his pajamas. He was sitting on the damp earth with his knees pulled up to his chest in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat. The biting chill of the Mississippi night had turned his lips a pale shade of blue because he had been exposed to the elements for hours. A thick strip of gray duct tape covered his mouth to silence his cries for help. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw me emerge from the shadows of the graves. He looked at me with a heartbreaking mixture of terror and relief as tears streamed down his freezing cheeks. Two large suitcases stood upright next to him on the grass, to signal that Brenda had planned to abandon him here permanently. I turned my gaze toward the woman who shared my bloodline to look for any sign of regret. Brenda simply exhaled a long plume of smoke before she hopped off the hood of her car to confront me. She did not look ashamed of what she had done to a defenseless 8-year-old boy. She actually looked proud of herself for executing a plan that she believed was necessary for our family. She flicked her cigarette butt onto the ground near my son's feet, before looking me directly in the eyes with a smirk. She gestured toward the trembling boy and the suitcases with a wave of her hand as if she were presenting a gift. She broke the silence with a voice that dripped with venom when she said, "I am just teaching the brat a necessary lesson about survival, so you can finally focus on selling that house without distractions." The mention of the house snapped the last thread of restraint holding me together. I did not scream or argue because logic had no place in a conversation with a monster. I lunged at her with the ferocity of a wild animal protecting its young. My hands found her shoulders as I shoved her backward with enough force to send her stumbling into the side of her vehicle. She tried to grab my hair to retaliate, but I was fueled by an adrenaline that made me stronger than I had ever been. I pushed her down onto the damp grass, before turning my back on her to rip the tape from Austin's face. I worked frantically to untie the complex knots, while keeping my body between him and the woman who had put him there. A sudden explosion of blue and red lights flooded the cemetery grounds to blind us momentarily. The deafening wail of sirens cut through the night as Officer Miller led a team of patrolmen through the cemetery gates. I had dialed emergency services the second I saw the GPS location, but it felt like a lifetime until they arrived. They swarmed the area with weapons drawn as they commanded Brenda to stay on the ground. She looked shocked that I had actually involved the authorities in what she considered a private family matter. Officer Miller wasted no time in pulling her arms behind her back to secure the handcuffs with a satisfying click. They dragged Brenda toward the patrol car, while she screamed obscenities and blamed me for ruining her life. She yelled that I was the one who abandoned him, even though she was the one being arrested for child endangerment. I ignored her completely, as I wrapped my coat around Austin to shield him from the cold and the sight of his aunt being taken away. I lifted him into my arms to feel his small heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. He buried his face in my neck while sobbing uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally left his system. I held him tighter than I ever had before while watching the police car disappear into the night. I made a silent vow, right there among the graves, that Brenda would pay for every second of fear she caused us. 3 hours later, the eerie silence of the graveyard was replaced by the chaotic beeping of hospital monitors and the smell of antiseptic. I sat by the bedside in the pediatric emergency wing, while holding my son's hand as he drifted into a fitful sleep. The attending physician had recently informed me that Austin was suffering from mild hypothermia and severe psychological trauma due to the prolonged exposure and fear. He insisted that the boy remain under specialized observation for at least 24 hours to ensure no physical complications developed, and to begin a mental health assessment. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice while I watched my child flinch at every distant sound in the hallway. The swinging doors of the ward burst open as my mother rushed into the room with a frantic energy that I initially mistook for genuine concern. However, she did not even glance toward the bed where her grandson lay pale and trembling under layers of heated blankets. Instead, she marched directly toward me with her face flushed a deep shade of angry red to begin a verbal assault that made my blood run cold. She looked at me with pure accusation in her eyes, as if I were the criminal in this situation. She leaned down and hissed with a venomous tone. "Are you crazy? You called the police on your own sister, just because of a harmless prank." I stood there in stunned silence for a moment, because I could not fathom how any grandmother could describe kidnapping and tying a child in a cemetery as a prank. I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone before playing the recording of our conversation from earlier that night. The sound of her voice lying to me about Austin being safe at home filled the hospital room to prove she was an active participant in this nightmare. I showed her the timestamp that confirmed she had deliberately misled me while my son was being terrorized in the dark. She did not even flinch when confronted with the evidence of her own betrayal. As she shifted her strategy to emotional manipulation, she began to wring her hands and adopted a pathetic, tearful tone that she had used to control me for decades. She looked at me and pleaded. "Brenda has had a hard life, and she owes dangerous people a lot of money. You have everything you could ever want. So why cannot you just forgive her and help her out of this mess?" The realization that my mother valued Brenda's comfort more than Austin's life was the final blow to our relationship. I realized that as long as she was in our lives, my son would never truly be safe from their shared delusions and greed. I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me as I stood up to my full height and pointed toward the exit with a steady hand. My voice did not tremble when I looked her in the eye to deliver the final verdict on our bond. I spoke with a chilling coldness as I said, "Get out. From this moment on, you are not welcome near my son or me, ever again." She tried to protest, but I called for the hospital security guard, who was standing just outside the door. I watched as they escorted her out of the ward, while she continued to scream about how ungrateful I was for everything she had done. I sat back down and took a deep breath of the sterile air to realize that the family I once knew was officially dead. I looked at Austin and promised him that I would build a new world for us where nobody would ever hurt him again. The next morning the sun rose over Jackson, exposing the ugly secrets my family had tried to hide in the dark. The humid Mississippi air felt heavy as I brought Austin home from the hospital. But I was no longer alone in this fight. My husband David had managed to catch the earliest flight back from his business trip, the moment he heard my frantic voicemail. He met us at the front door and pulled both of us into a crushing embrace that made me feel safe for the first time in 24 hours. His face was a mask of cold fury as he immediately began inspecting every window and door while preparing to overhaul our entire home security system. He vowed that no one, especially not my own flesh and blood, would ever breach our sanctuary again. My best friend Sarah arrived shortly after, with a basket of food and a quiet determination to help us navigate the chaos. She stayed by Austin's side in the living room to keep him distracted with books, while David and I retreated to the office to review the security footage. Sarah looked at me with deep concern in her eyes before we started the recordings, because she knew how much this would hurt. She leaned in and whispered, "You need to check the house cameras regarding the spare key. Brenda couldn't have gotten Austin out without one, and we both know who probably gave it to her." David and I sat in front of the monitors to begin the painful process of scrolling through the previous night's footage. My heart sank when I saw a familiar figure approaching our porch, while I was still miles away in the air. Brenda had walked up to the front door with a confidence that proved she had no fear of being caught. She reached into a flower pot to retrieve a spare key that only my mother and I knew about. It was undeniable proof that my mother had secretly handed over the key to facilitate this kidnapping. We watched in horror as Brenda entered our home and spent nearly 30 minutes rummaging through my office filing cabinets. She was not looking for toys or clothes, but was frantically searching for the original house deed and my father's estate papers. It was only after she failed to find the documents that she went upstairs to wake my sleeping son. As we continued to investigate the house, David discovered a designer handbag that Brenda had carelessly left behind in her rush to get to the cemetery. We emptied the contents onto the kitchen table to find a mountain of evidence that explained her desperation. The bag was stuffed with final notice bills from multiple casinos and aggressive letters from high-interest loan sharks, threatening legal action. There were also handwritten notes detailing the current market value of our neighborhood properties. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening clarity that made my skin crawl. David slammed his fist onto the wooden table in a rare outburst of anger as he connected the dots. He looked at the pile of debt notices and then at the security monitor showing Brenda's intrusion. He shouted in frustration. She wasn't just scaring him. She wanted to force us to sell the house to pay off her gambling debts. The realization that my sister was willing to traumatize a child to settle her own financial failures was the ultimate betrayal. She knew that according to our father's will, I had the sole right to sell the property, but she was entitled to half the proceeds if a sale occurred. By making Austin feel unsafe in his own home, she hoped I would flee the city and put the house on the market immediately. I felt a surge of cold resolve as I gathered the bag and the saved video files. I picked up the phone to call our family attorney and the lead detective on the case to provide this new evidence. I was going to ensure Brenda was charged with more than just child endangerment. I wanted her prosecuted for illegal breaking and entering and attempted extortion to make sure she stayed behind bars for a very long time. 2 days after the arrest, my phone began to ring incessantly with unknown numbers, marking the start of a new nightmare. I soon discovered that my mother had made the unthinkable decision to use her entire life savings and mortgage, her small retirement home, to post bail for Brenda. Within hours of being released from custody, while awaiting trial, the two of them launched a systematic campaign of psychological harassment designed to break my spirit. They did not care about the trauma they had already caused Austin, as they shifted their focus toward saving Brenda from the consequences of her crimes. My phone was flooded with hateful text messages and voicemails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, who were only hearing a twisted version of the truth. The harassment quickly moved beyond digital messages and began to poison our social standing in the small, tight-knit community of Jackson. My mother and Brenda spent their days walking through the town square and visiting local shops to spread malicious rumors about my character. They claimed that I was an ungrateful and greedy daughter who had manufactured a fake scenario to frame my sister, just so I could keep our father's entire inheritance for myself. I noticed the judgmental stares from neighbors when I went to collect the mail, and the awkward silences that followed me whenever I entered a local business. People who had known me since I was a child were suddenly looking at me with suspicion, as if I were the villain who had destroyed my own family for money. The situation reached a boiling point a few days later, when I was forced to run a quick errand at the local supermarket. As I was walking down the frozen food aisle, I saw Brenda and my mother waiting for me, as if they had been tracking my movements. Brenda looked disheveled, but her eyes were burning with a manic intensity that made me grip my shopping cart until my knuckles turned white. She deliberately blocked my path with her body and began to speak in a loud, shrill voice that echoed through the store to ensure every shopper could hear her accusations. She was putting on a performance to once again cast herself as the victim, while my mother stood behind her with a smug expression. Brenda stepped closer into my personal space and shouted, "You think you are so smart? Wait until I tell the judge how you abuse your own son, and how this was all a setup to get rid of me." The audacity of her lie sent a surge of cold fury through my veins that replaced any fear I might have felt. I did not back down or try to hide from the curious eyes of the other customers who were now gathering around us to watch the drama unfold. I took a step forward to close the gap between us until I was looking directly into Brenda's bloodshot eyes. I realized that the only way to stop a bully was to expose their lies to the light of day with the undeniable truth. I made sure my voice was steady and loud enough to resonate across the entire produce section so that everyone would know exactly what kind of monster they were standing next to. I looked her in the eye and responded with a voice like ice. "The only abuser here is the one who tied an 8-year-old boy to a graveyard fence at 1 in the morning." The effect of my words was instantaneous, as the murmurs from the crowd shifted from curiosity to audible gasps of horror. People who had been listening to Brenda's rumors suddenly looked at her with disgust, as the sheer depravity of her actions was laid bare. Brenda's face turned a deep shade of crimson, and she began to stammer, as she realized she had lost control of the narrative in front of her neighbors. My mother tried to pull her away while looking at the ground in shame, because they both knew that there was no way to justify what had happened at the cemetery. They hurried toward the exit as people began to point and whisper about the woman who would do such a thing to her own nephew. Even though I had won that small battle, I knew that their desperation would only grow as the trial date approached. I returned home to find David already on the phone with a private security firm, because he had sensed the escalating danger, just as I had. He made the executive decision to hire a professional bodyguard to escort Austin to and from school every single day. We also spent the evening working with a technician to upgrade our home alarm system to the highest possible grade with motion sensors and panic buttons in every room. We were effectively turning our home into a fortress, because we were preparing for the worst-case scenario from two women who had nothing left to lose. 1 week later, under the cover of a stormy Mississippi night, Brenda made her fatal mistake, just as we expected. The heavy rain pounded against the roof to create a wall of sound that she clearly thought would mask her movements. Driven by the relentless pressure from her loan sharks and having exhausted every penny of my mother's savings, Brenda was desperate for a quick payout to save her own skin. She had observed us from afar and mistakenly believed my earlier social media posts about taking Austin out of the state for his recovery. She thought the house was empty, or at least that I was vulnerable without David, who she assumed was still dealing with security upgrades at his office. Little did she know her every move was being tracked by the very technology she had failed to find during her first intrusion. Shortly after midnight, a sharp crash echoed from the rear of the property as she used a heavy stone to shatter the basement window. Brenda climbed through the jagged glass and navigated the dark corridors of our home, with a flashlight to head straight for the master bedroom. She was unaware that David had specifically installed a high-tech silent alarm system that bypassed the traditional sirens to alert the local police precinct immediately. While she moved upstairs with greed in her heart, multiple patrol cars were already turning onto our quiet street, with their lights and sirens off to ensure she had no chance of escape. We sat in the darkened study with the officers to watch her silhouette on the internal monitor as she reached the small floor safe hidden in the closet. As Brenda was hunched over the safe while frantically trying to pry it open with a crowbar, the overhead lights suddenly flashed on to blind her. She scrambled to her feet and looked around in a panic to find David and me standing in the doorway, blocking her only exit alongside 2 armed police officers. The look of utter shock on her face quickly twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage when she realized she had been lured into a trap. There was no more pretense of being a victim or a misunderstanding, as she realized her freedom was officially over. She gripped the crowbar tightly, as if she considered attacking us before the officers commanded her to drop the weapon. Backed into a corner with nowhere left to run, Brenda erupted into a manic scream that revealed the true depth of her lifelong resentment. She began to shriek at the top of her lungs, letting out every dark thought she had harbored since we were children. She glared at me with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "I hate you. You always get everything without even trying. Mom always loved me more. But Dad gave you this house and everything in it. It is not fair that I have to struggle while you live like a queen." The sheer entitlement in her voice made my heart ache for the father who had seen through her facade years ago. I looked at the woman who had terrorized my child for a few $1,000s, and felt nothing but a profound sense of pity mixed with disgust. I realized that her hatred wasn't about the money or the house, but about her own inability to take responsibility for her failures. I took a step toward her while the officers moved in to secure her arms, and spoke the final words that would end our relationship forever. I looked her directly in the eye and said, "Dad knew exactly who you were and what you were capable of. That is why he gave me the house to ensure his grandson would have a home, and why he protected Austin from someone as toxic as you." The officers forced her to the ground and pulled her arms behind her back to snap the handcuffs shut for the second time in 2 weeks. This time the charges were far more severe, because she had been caught in the act of a felony burglary, while out on bail for child endangerment. The lead officer informed us that based on her violent outburst and the evidence of premeditation, the judge would almost certainly revoke her bail entirely. We watched from the window as she was shoved into the back of a transport van, while the Mississippi rain washed away the last traces of her presence from our lives. Brenda was finally headed to a cell where she could no longer threaten my son or poison our peace, marking the definitive end to her reign of terror. On the morning of the trial, the air inside the courthouse was thick with tension, as I prepared to face my family one last time. The grand stone building in downtown Jackson felt cold and intimidating, but I walked through the doors with my head held high, and David's hand firmly in mine. Inside the courtroom, Brenda sat at the defense table, looking frail and pale, in an obvious attempt to garner sympathy from the jury. Her defense attorney wasted no time in painting a pathetic picture of a woman suffering from severe depression and crumbling under the immense pressure of debt. He argued that her actions were a desperate cry for help rather than a criminal act, and he shamelessly requested a lenient sentence of community service and psychiatric probation. I watched as my mother sat in the front row clutching her rosary and nodding along to every word of the lawyer's lies. The atmosphere shifted the moment I was called to the witness stand to testify about the night that changed everything. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the jurors, while I calmly recounted every horrific detail of that night at the cemetery. I described the biting cold of the Mississippi air, and the sound of my son's muffled sobs while he was bound to that rusted iron fence like an animal. I emphasized the chilling smile on Brenda's face, and the absolute lack of remorse she showed, while Austin was trembling in terror. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence, as the reality of her cruelty began to sink in, and I could see the disgust growing on the faces of the people who held her fate in their hands. To finalize the case, the prosecutor presented the most damning piece of evidence we had gathered. He played the high-definition security footage from the night of the burglary, where Brenda was caught red-handed. The entire room watched and listened as she shrieked about her jealousy and her calculated plan to force me to sell the house for her own gain. Her voice was loud and clear, completely shattering the defense's argument of a mental health crisis or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a recorded confession of greed and malice that left no room for doubt or excuses. Brenda's attorney looked down at his notes in defeat, while the jury members shook their heads in disbelief at her recorded admission of hate. After a surprisingly short deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience, looked down at Brenda with an expression of pure disdain before he gripped his gavel. He spoke with a voice that boomed through the silent room, to deliver the justice my son deserved. He looked at the defendant and declared, "Your actions were not a cry for help, but a calculated act of evil against an innocent child. For the charges of kidnapping, child endangerment, and burglary, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison, without the possibility of parole." Brenda immediately collapsed onto the table, wailing in a mixture of shock and self-pity, as the reality of her long sentence finally hit her. In the gallery behind her, the drama continued as my mother let out a sharp cry and fainted into the arms of a nearby bailiff upon hearing that her favorite daughter would be spending the next decade behind bars. I didn't move to help her, or even look back, as I felt a massive weight finally lift from my shoulders. Before the session was adjourned, the judge addressed the secondary issue regarding my son's safety and my mother's role in the crime. He looked at the evidence of her complicity and issued a final ironclad ruling to protect my family. He stated firmly, "The court also grants a permanent restraining order against the grandmother, forbidding any contact with the victim Austin for the rest of her natural life." I walked out of that courtroom feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't known in months. David pulled me into a hug as we stood on the courthouse steps, and for the first time I knew the nightmare was truly over. We had faced the monsters in our own family, and we had won. Justice had been served in the most absolute way, ensuring that Austin would grow up in a world where those toxic influences could never reach him again. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell, bringing a final end to the nightmare that almost destroyed us. The Mississippi heat was beginning to intensify, but for the first time in years, the air inside our home felt light and free of lingering tension. Despite the victory in court, David and I realized that we could never truly find peace in a house that had been breached by such malice. We made the difficult but necessary decision to put the old family home on the market to erase the memories of Brenda's intrusion and the cold shadows of that cemetery night. We packed our lives into boxes and moved to a vibrant coastal city in North Carolina, where the sound of the ocean waves replaced the haunting echoes of the past. It was a fresh start that we all desperately needed to heal properly. The sale of the property was finalized quickly, and the legal distribution of the proceeds was handled with strict court supervision to ensure total fairness. According to my father's will, the money was technically supposed to be split equally, but the judge had made a special ruling regarding Brenda's portion of the inheritance. Her half was immediately frozen by the state and redirected to cover the massive psychological therapy bills for Austin and the restitution for the damages she caused. What remained was seized by her long list of creditors and the gambling establishment she had defrauded over the years. Brenda ended up with absolutely nothing but a prison ID number, while her greed had effectively stripped her of the very fortune she had tried so hard to steal. Watching Austin thrive in our new environment was the greatest reward for everything we had endured during the trial. He had found a new passion for life and joined the local youth swimming club, where he spent his afternoons laughing with new friends under the bright sun. The haunted look in his eyes had finally vanished, replaced by the innocent spark of a child who feels completely safe and loved. He no longer woke up screaming from nightmares about the graveyard, and he wasn't afraid to sleep with the lights off anymore. We had fought a war to protect his childhood, and seeing him stand on the podium after his first race made every struggle worth it. Shortly after we settled into our new home, a thick envelope arrived in the mail with a return address from the State Women's Correctional Facility. I recognized Brenda's messy handwriting on the front, and for a split second, I wondered if it contained an apology or more venomous accusations. However, I realized that I no longer cared what she had to say, because her words no longer held any power over my life or my family. I walked over to the fireplace and tossed the unopened letter into the dancing flames without a single moment of hesitation. I watched as the paper curled and turned to ash, seeing the last remnants of her toxic influence disappear forever into the chimney. My mother tried to reach out through various cousins, but I remained firm in the no-contact rule that the court had helped establish. She had chosen her side that night at the hospital, and I had chosen mine by prioritizing the safety of my son over the delusions of a woman who protected a criminal. I learned a painful but vital lesson through this ordeal. Blood might make you related, but loyalty and love are what make you a family. Being a mother meant being a shield, and I would never apologize for standing my ground against anyone who dared to threaten the person I loved most in this world. This journey taught me that misplaced tolerance toward toxic family members is nothing short of a crime against your own peace. Never let the title of sister or mother blind you to the reality of abusive and dangerous behavior, because protecting your children is your only sacred responsibility. I hope my story serves as a reminder to trust your instincts and to walk away from anyone who brings darkness into your home, regardless of their DNA. True family are the people who stand by you in the storm, not the ones who create it. Thank you so much for listening to my story and standing by me through these difficult chapters. Do you believe the 15-year sentence was a fair punishment for what Brenda did to Austin? Would you have been able to cut ties with your mother if she had betrayed you, like mine did? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because I truly value your perspectives. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and justice.